In this Warmaster video, I'm going to take a look at every official Warmaster army list and place them on a tier list. A tier list is simply a visual representation of how I will rate every Warmaster army in terms of how easy they are to use and how effective they are. This is an entirely subjective list based upon my own experiences and doesn't necessarily correlate to an army's performance in any given tournament setting. And I'll explain why this is at the end. The tier list follows the universal grading system with F at the bottom, leading up to A at the top, and then a superlative or S tier above everything else. I'm going to rate the army lists from worst to best in my opinion. Please feel free to agree or disagree with my ratings in the comments below. So let's begin with our first entry, and that's going to be right at the bottom in F tier.
What the hell is that?
Okay, I don't believe that any Warmaster army is so bad that you cannot win with it. But the one thing that does have the power to make you lose every time is the dice. Learning how to stack the odds in your favour and mitigate against bad luck is one of the hardest skills to attain in Warmaster. You can pick the strongest faction and write the perfect list, and still lose if the dice do not roll your way. So let's move up to E tier next and look at some of the more challenging armies to play with. Right at the bottom are the Ogre Kingdoms. The Ogres have some excellent infantry, but that is it. They simply don't have the mobile elements required to compete against enemy cavalry. The majority of their troops are also very expensive, and they have several unit types which are just not very useful. So in my opinion, this makes Ogres particularly unforgiving and very hard to win with. Next up in E tier, and only slightly better than the Ogres, are the Goblins. The Goblins can field a strong defensive game with masses of cheap artillery, but their infantry is of very poor quality and they're completely hamstrung by the low command values of their characters. So it's really hard to get the Goblins to do what you want them to. Next up in E tier we have the Beastmen. In my opinion, the Beastman list is just too disjointed to make it competitive. There are some very good units and some very bad units, and they don't seem to support each other well, while the ambush rule is very hard to pull off effectively. So Beastmen can be quite challenging to play. The last army in E tier and the best of the worst are the Witch Hunters. In my opinion, the Witch Hunters are just a not as good version of the Empire. They can field an awful lot of units, but their lack of mobility counts against them. So unless you play against Chaos or Undead, Witch Hunters are another challenging army. Moving up to D tier we have armies which are still quite hard to use effectively, and at the bottom of D tier I've put the Chaos Dwarfs. The Chaos Dwarfs have some excellent heavy infantry and very good artillery, but it is hard to use the mobile elements in combination with the rest of the army. They also suffer with units which are not very cost effective or of limited use. Next on the list, and just above Chaos Dwarfs, I've put the Norse. Norse also have excellent heavy infantry and a lot of terror-causing options. However, they will struggle against enemy heavy cavalry, and a number of their units seem quite expensive for what they do. With no means of forcing the enemy to come to them, the Norse have to play aggressively, which is hard to do with an infantry-based army. Moving on up towards the middle of D tier, we've got the Skaven. Skaven do have some excellent units at their disposal, but their big drawback is they're an infantry-only army, and they do suffer at the hands of heavy cavalry or artillery. Similar to Norse, they have to cross the board to attack the enemy, and this makes them vulnerable to having their brigades attacked piecemeal and broken up before they can bring their weight of numbers to bear. Just above the Skaven, I have put Kislev. Kislev are a highly mobile army, but victory is often linked to how well their war wagons perform, and although they can be a very heavy hitting army, they just don't have the resilience to weather attrition. And the amount of special rules you'll have to learn to play the army can be quite intimidating. Next up in D tier I've put the Demons. Demons look great on paper with some fantastic units available to them. But the big problem with this army is instability. As your army takes attrition, you may find that you bring your enemy ever so close to breaking, but then end up losing the game as your own units fade away. The trick is to kill enough of the enemy before the demons defeat themselves. At the higher end of D tier, I've placed the Dogs of War. They have a great variety of infantry units, plus artillery and flyers. They also have access to both heavy and light cavalry. The downside is their appalling core infantry, the pikemen. And for me, that's enough to prevent Dogs of War from occupying a more competitive tier. At the top end of D tier, I've put Wood Elves. So yes, they may have the greatest number of options and the most special rules of any army, but it's surprisingly hard to win with Wood Elves. And this comes down to the fact that Wood Elves are a shooting army, and Warmaster is not a game designed to win via shooting. Still, they do have a Command 10 General, and this allows them to compete against the big boys. Moving on to C tier, we begin to see the armies which are a lot easier to use. And the first one I've placed is Chaos. Chaos fields the best cavalry and the best infantry in the game. But Chaos troops are also the most expensive in all of Warmaster. So playing Chaos is always somewhat of a gamble. You're going to win big or lose big, depending on whether you can get your best troops into combat. And because your army is going to be quite small, it is quite hard to recover from any mistakes you make early on. Just above Chaos in C tier, I've placed the Dwarfs. The Dwarfs have a lot of strengths: a Command 10 General, the ability to dispel enemy magic, solid infantry, and excellent artillery. What they lack, however, is any kind of cavalry. Therefore, Dwarfs will perform excellently if there's a lot of defendable terrain on the battlefield, and perform poorly if you play on a bowling green. So for me, this factor prevents the Dwarfs from gaining a higher ranking. Right in the centre of C tier, I have placed the Tomb Kings. Tomb Kings have excellent artillery, flyers, mobility, shooting, monsters, and magic. What they lack is a decent command range, and this factor, combined with their lack of initiative, means that with this army more than any other, you must get your key orders off at the right time. If you mess up, the enemy will quickly take you apart. So for me, they are solid C tier. Next in C tier, we have the Orcs. Now, I know what you're thinking. This guy's crazy, he's put a Command 8 army in C tier. But bear with me. Orcs have great infantry, great cavalry, and great characters. They're also very cheap, so you can field a lot of them. Orcs are strongest when you field lots of brigades and lots of characters to order those brigades. Their magic is also excellent, and in my experience, an Orc heavy cavalry army is very hard to beat. So for these reasons, Orcs get a high place in C tier. At the very top end of C tier, I'm placing the Empire. Empire have some fantastic units at their disposal: unlimited knights, excellent cannon, massed shooting, terror-causing characters, and a tank. Their spell list is also very good, and in my personal experience, I found playing very aggressively with Empire works very well. Your artillery will force the enemy to come to you, then you can hammer them with multiple knight units. So for this reason, I think Empire are the best of the mid-tier armies. Next we move up to B tier, which are in my opinion the more competitive armies. First off we have Albion. Albion have great infantry, great flyers, spammable chariots and chaff, and a very useful spell list, which includes a summonable, terror-causing monster for free. Albion have the tools to get the job done, and for that reason I'm putting them slightly above average. Next highest in B tier, I've put Bretonnia. Bretonnian knights are among the best hammer units in the game. You also get access to excellent artillery and flyers in the same list, whilst the spell list complements the army very well. Bretonnia can also employ an excellent counter-strike strategy, grinding the enemy down with waves of peasants before launching a counter-assault with the excellent knights. In my book, this earns them a solid B tier placing. Right in the centre of B tier, I've put the Vampire Counts. The Vampires place slightly higher than the Tomb Kings, based on the fact they have access to heavy cavalry and heroes. Combine this with the fact that Vampires have, in my opinion, the strongest spell list in the game, and you have an army which can project multiple threats at various points of the battle line, which can be very hard for the enemy to deal with. They also have access to the cheapest troops in the game, and with the ability to raise more units into combat, trying to outgrind the Vampires is a bad idea. On top of this, Vampires have the most terror-causing options of any army, so for me they're right in the middle of B tier. Just above the Vampires I have placed the Lizardmen. Lizardmen have an excellent command structure, solid infantry, solid cavalry, and some of the best flyers in the game. Their spell list is also brilliantly effective, and their only downside is the relatively slow movement rate of the army. Lizardmen are a very tough opponent to beat, and their playstyle is quite forgiving. So for these reasons they place very highly in B tier. However, there is one more army in B tier which I have placed above the Lizardmen. Araby. In my opinion, Araby elephants are the most cost-effective unit in the entire game. This excellent hammer unit, combined with unlimited knights, a great selection of missile cavalry, unique flyers, and 2 terror-causing mounts, make Araby a very competitive army. The icing on the cake is the fantastic spell list. And without wishing to blow my own trumpet, at time of recording, my Araby tournament army is still undefeated. So for these reasons, Araby are easily top place in B tier. Finally, we move up to A tier, which contains the cream of the Warmaster crop. Firstly, we have the Dark Elves. Dark Elves are a very aggressive army with a command 10 general and super heavy cavalry. If you can get your knights into combat, they will carry the game for you. Dark Elves also have excellent mobility with their flyers and light cavalry, a useful spell list, and terror. Their only downside is the Dark Elf Blunderall, which can kill off your heroes and reduce the general's command value down to 8 over the course of the battle. However, the fact that you can take magic items to mitigate against this means that for me Dark Elves are a solid A tier faction. Placing above the Dark Elves and taking the top spot on my tier list are the High Elves. The High Elves are simply the best at moving their troops where they need to be, as their general is command 10, they have unlimited heavy cavalry and access to flyers. Warmaster is a game of command and manoeuvre, and the High Elves do this better than anyone else. They don't have to rely upon undercosted or spammable or superpowered unit types. In fact, their army selection is quite humble compared to other lists. But for me, the High Elves just exemplify what makes Warmaster such a great game. You can march your glittering host across the battlefield, attack the enemy where they are weakest, turn them around and roll up their line. The visual spectacle of a well-commanded High Elf army outmanoeuvring the enemy is a sight to be seen. High Elves are an excellent choice for the beginner Warmaster player, as their command 10 general is so forgiving. So for these reasons, High Elves are the best. But we're not quite finished yet. There is something which I'm going to put in S tier above every other army. Far more important than your choice of army is player skill. I purposely have not put any army in S tier, as I firmly believe that no Warmaster army is invincible. A good player can take an Ogre Kingdom's army and beat a High Elf army. And this is another reason why I like Warmaster so much. It rewards experience. You can't just go to the internet, print off a list and expect to win at Warmaster. You have to invest time in learning how your army plays. You have to learn strategies to counter the enemy's tactics. So with enough practice you can mitigate for bad luck and turn a losing battle into a crushing victory. In conclusion, I hope you've enjoyed watching this tier list video. Why not have a go at making your own tier list and let me know how yours differs from mine in the comments below. As always, thank you very much for watching.